We're going on a radio journey, back to a unique era of broadcasting in Ireland, a time when pirates ruled the airwaves. We're tuning into the 1980s.
Moment linger where the streets have no name.
Hello, I'm Russell or Russ Padmore, and this is the final episode of my three-part documentary series recalling the impact of pirate radio in the Northwest during the 1980s. A senior unionist politician tells me how unlicensed broadcasters based in the Republic gained listeners in Protestant communities across the border.
It was seen as a bit of a neutral space, or a space where, particularly at difficult times, that people could switch off, in one sense, switch off from the political issues and problems.
Listeners from nationalist communities in the north were also strong supporters of local pirate stations.
The levers of power in the north were very much the newsletter, Belfast Telegraph. Those were very much unionist dominated. The BBC was totally unionist dominated. So suddenly to have a local station, people loved it.
And pirates encouraged more women to get on air.
I did news broadcasts. I also did interview programmes.
It's coming around at 22 minutes before 12 this morning on 96 FM, KTOK Radio, the Northwest's #1 radio station. And we're counting down the Northwest Top 30. That's Jodie Watley, her brand new one, this week at number 28. And at number 27, from the LP Crimes of Conscience, they're back again. The boys from Wexford making an appearance here on KTOK Radio with The Girl in the Ghetto.
In the 1980s, I was known to tens of thousands of radio listeners in the Northwest as Russ Padmore. I was also a disc jockey in nightclubs, so I played the role of a cool DJ, making people think I was spinning hit records in a luxurious, well-equipped studio. Amazingly, it worked. I presented programmes on pirate broadcasters in Waterford, Mullingar and Donegal, where I also managed a radio station in Buncrana and even owned one in Donegal Town. In the two previous episodes, we heard how unlicensed stations in Ireland were influenced by pirates broadcasting from ships in the 1960s.
This is wonderful Radio London. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline.
The famous veteran British disc jockey Tony Blackburn worked on the offshore pirates Radio Caroline and Radio London. He explained how Irish pirates influenced a new wave of illegal broadcasters in the 80s in the UK.
I was very aware that there was a lot of pirate radio in Ireland. It was all land-based, I believe, and they set up transmitters all over the place. I thought it was great. And eventually, of course, in London and home counties, they started doing the same over here as well.
Daniel O'Donnell revealed how his career took off thanks to pirate radio in Donegal.
Pirate radio was very important for me because I kind of started the same time as the pirate radios were coming on stream.
And Michael Bradley, a guitarist with the Undertones, told me how he enjoyed being a disc jockey on a pirate station.
A wee cottage in kind of the middle of nowhere. There was a transmitter outside. I really enjoyed it, playing the records that I liked.
On AM and FM for the Greater Northwestern area, this is NWCR.
Northwest Community Radio News at 4 o'clock with Caroline Haggerty. Good afternoon.
That's an original recording from the 1980s of Caroline O'Hara, who was known on air in Buncrana as Caroline Haggerty. I was the station manager at NWCR at the time. Pirate radio encouraged more diversity among the voices on air, and women got their first break in broadcasting, as she explained to me in the unusual setting of the Railway Museum in Derry.
I did news broadcasts. I had to compile the news. I had to manage the advertising slots and do the scripts and do some voiceovers for ads and things. On a Thursday morning for an hour, I would have interviewed guests that came along and really brought maybe a female perspective to a lot of the interviews. And again, most of our listeners would have been maybe, especially during the day, were women at home or people maybe working in factories and things, a large female contingent.
Suddenly, there's a creation of many news stations, all of them in the Republic, whether it be Donegal or other counties along the border, broadcasting into the North or Northern Ireland. How would you say they impacted communities across the border?
Well, I grew up in the North in the 60s and 70s. We didn't listen to RTE. People in Donegal listened to RTE, so they knew about all these country music singers and people that I'd never heard of. So even the music was very different.
Shut me off, make me an island, I'm yours.
And the dances that people went to that lived in Donegal, they would have had Joe Dolan coming to Donegal. I'd never heard of him. I actually interviewed him then on NWCR. He came up one time and launched one of his LPs. This was what people in the rural areas listened to, and it was the same for our catchment area, and the radio went right across, as you say, to Limavady, across the Foyle to Coleraine, that whole north coast.
Caroline O'Hara, recalling her days of broadcasting on a pirate radio station, NWCR. More diversity of on-air presenters led to subjects like the arts getting more coverage, as Celine McGlynn, a Donegal-based artist and editor of the Finn Valley Voice newspaper in Ballybuffet, recalls.
Yeah, that was a huge change for the arts, and I am a visual artist myself, I paint, and when I was young, there wouldn't have been no such thing as an exhibition anywhere. You'd have had to go away to see paintings. I didn't see paintings myself until I went to Dublin, to the National Gallery. Even art groups became established here, and were broadcast on local radio. It gave people just a more fuller life.
You never look nice if you're cold, And please, no drinking and driving in the Northwest. Thank you. Here is Heart, What About Love on 96 and 99 FM in stereo with Laura live until 9 o'clock. By the way, romantic interlude just around the corner, so hold on. I've been lonely, I've been waiting for you.
Laura Hughes on my radio station KTOK in the late 1980s. I thought it was important to have female voices on air, and more diversity would enhance the programming. It wasn't my intention to reshape the history of broadcasting, but I paved the way for more women to have the opportunity to become broadcasters on local radio. Today, Laura Hughes is a singer in a band and writes music, but she recalls KTOK radio had a positive influence.
I think it had a real cosmopolitan flavour. It had a great energy and a buzz about it that we hadn't seen the likes of really in Donegal. A sense of something new and changing.
You would say then that those unlicensed radio stations shook up the broadcasting industry at that time, in that era?
There was literally two stations, I think it was RTE1 and RTE2. When KTOK came along, it felt like there was a choice. It was reflective of what young people wanted to hear, and it was also actually guiding us in what we should be listening to.
The advantage of the local radio stations was the fact that they were based in the region, not in Belfast, not in London, not in Dublin.
The idea that it was local and it was actually very cool as well was really appealing. The sense of fun. KTOK was very professional. It was structured like you would hear it in a large city. It certainly didn't sound like it was based in a wee small heritage town like Donegal Town.
Pirate radio, unlicensed radio, allowed more women to get into broadcasting than had happened before.
What's the statistical likelihood of a person like me ever managing to get on a national radio station? So it just gave us an opportunity to do something that we would never have been able to do before. I would never have thought I could have become a radio presenter, a DJ, and it was just amazing.
Having so many women, new women on air, must have changed the type of broadcasting, surely?
Absolutely. I remember the other girl that was on it, she liked her kind of indie pop type thing. I liked a broad section of music. So for me, it was about like all the requests and dedications. I had a romantic slot called the romantic interlude, and there would be hundreds of requests coming in, or birthday requests.
Laura, there was obviously an impact on various communities too, based on the fact the radio station was local. How do you recall that impact on the communities, whether they were in counties Donegal or across the border in Fermanagh, Tyrone, Derry?
The first thing is that we were bringing people together. We crossed all communities with our playlist and with our responsible broadcasting. So in effect, it was one of those things during a really difficult time in history where, you know, we were that element of peace and coming together of communities, I suppose. No matter what shop or business you went in, you would hear us playing on the airways. So it was something that bridged that gap between communities for sure.
You're listening to a history of pirate radio in the Northwest during the 1980s. Still to come, how the need to maintain technology for pirates equipped engineers with skills that would prove useful for the future revolution of mobile phones.
Once the phones came along, it was a mass rollout thing and proper, infrastructure, proper towers, concrete bases.
70,000 people attend the funeral of the MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, Bobby Sands. 1984, the IRA have achieved their most daring strike on the British mainland.
We say never! Never!
The 1980s was a dark period in Northern Ireland amid the violence of the Troubles, as reported by the BBC in 1986. In Buncrana, as the station manager, I insisted North West Community Radio stayed away from politics and concentrated on entertainment as well as local news. I repeated this policy at KTOK, my own station in South Donegal, and it helped to gain listeners in nationalist and unionist communities across the border. Elsewhere in Ireland, politicians were taking advantage of the platform provided by unlicensed broadcasters to get their message to local voters. Professor Owen Devereux is a social commentator at the University of Limerick. He worked on a local pirate radio station.
You had this lovely irony in the 1980s, while politicians were talking about, and political parties in Ireland were talking about radio stations being illegal, all the mainstream political parties at election time, not only did they participate in radio programs on so-called pirate radio, but they also paid for advertising for election campaigns on pirate radio. And I think that's a sign of them recognising the reach and the impact of it and so on.
Professor Owen Devereux, a social commentator at the University of Limerick. Gregory Campbell, a member of the British Parliament with the Democratic Unionist Party, remembers the impact of pirate radio stations in Donegal, close to Derry.
It was almost like a localised version of Radio Caroline, by and large listened to by people who felt that the sort of the more mainstream established radio stations didn't provide, particularly on the musical front, some of the music streams that you would be able to access nowadays. Obviously, there was a bit of the added thrill as well, I suppose, that because it was unlicensed, there was a bit of devil-may-care approach about being slightly unauthorised and therefore somewhat illegal.
Do you think they had a cultural impact on communities in Northern Ireland? They certainly sounded different, as you've said, to stations based in London, Belfast or Dublin.
I'm not sure that they had a big effect in terms of cultural outlook, but I think they appealed to an underbelly of desire for a particular type and brand of a musical genre that wasn't really reflective, particularly on the like of the BBC or some of the more mainstream radio stations.
What about the situation at the time of radio services operating just a few miles away, but on air without official permission? How much did that point to maybe the need for much more cooperation between the British and Irish authorities at the time to allow legalised radio?
Yeah, well, I think what it may have done is fast-track the need to try and upgrade radio licensing and ensure that it was fit for the 21st century.
How much would you say that perhaps these radio stations were, in a roundabout way, operating for both communities, whether it's loyalist or nationalist? These pirate radio stations were really taken to heart by everybody.
Yes, it was seen as a bit of a neutral space, or a space where, particularly at difficult times, that people could switch off, in one sense, switch off from the political issues and problems.
This was an era where there was little interaction between people who thought of themselves as either British or Irish. They didn't really mix that much, and yet radio somehow brought them together.
Sometimes people say that sport brings people together, which it does. But by and large, when people go along to attend a sporting event, they tend to switch off when they go to the event or listen to the series of programmes, and then switch back on again whenever they leave it. So I'm not so sure that it had any political connotation or lent itself to some sort of devising of improved relations. I think it presented itself as an outlet to switch off from the hardcore politics or divisions, and everybody was able to enjoy it irrespective of their background.
Gregory Campbell MP from the Democratic Unionist Party on the impact of pirate radio on people who identified themselves as British in the 1980s. On the nationalist side, Mark Durkan, a former leader of the SDLP, remembers Donegal's pirate radio stations had a positive influence on the community in Derry.
In a place like Derry and the broader northwest, a lot of us on the northern side of the border have family roots in the southern side of the border, and that would include a lot of people in the unionist community. So a lot of people in Derry and Strabane, our cousinage is in Donegal, and people were happy to be listening to the radio stations in Donegal and hearing bits of news from their associated townlands. Also the musical menu probably of those stations was probably very attractive. So it worked in a way that was much more comfortable and much more natural.
Broadcasting was very much focused on Belfast or Dublin or even London. Suddenly having a local station in the region in the northwest changed an awful lot. And there wasn't just one station, there was a handful.
In some senses, there was an air of subversion. We can go ahead and have these stations and they can be happening locally. And it's got this powerful reach. And this idea of radio in your own accent really appealed to people.
So do you think the radio stations which didn't have a licence but tried to act as though they were a legitimate business were actually contributing to the debate in society that eventually brought about peace under the Good Friday Agreement?
I think it allowed people to be very comfortable with the idea that things can happen, certainly in a border area, on a cross-border basis, that weren't threatening, that wasn't necessarily pushing some sort of agenda, that you weren't taking a different position on the constitutional status of Northern Ireland by virtue of what radio station you were listening to and the fact that you liked the music and you liked some of the conversation. A lot of the social, economic, local interest and cultural identity and affinity questions were able to be platformed in a way that meant that people were able to be more comfortable about the range of differences, and also people were maybe conditioned to be open to more possibilities and more prospects. You didn't have to frisk every new idea as though it had some sort of untoward or ulterior political agenda attached to it.
Mark Durkan, a former leader of the SDLP. By the late 1980s, the Irish government was under pressure from the UK to curb the influence of pirate radio stations in border areas, which was growing at the expense of licensed British broadcasters in Belfast and Derry. Professor John Horgan is an academic in Dublin who has studied the history of the media in Ireland.
I would say probably more in the Donegal area than in any other area. The British authorities, the Northern Ireland authorities, paid very little attention to this cross-border broadcasting for some years, until their own local stations began to become licensed, to become powerful and, of course, politically significant as well. So it was at that stage that the free rein, if you like, that the border stations broadcasting into Northern Ireland was curtailed and eventually quite satisfactorily limited from the Northern Ireland government's point of view.
Having a viable business in broadcasting, surely that was good for the community?
Oh, it was very good in two ways. It was good for the community itself. In one sense, you can say that the logjam created by the Labour Party's prohibition on licensing legislation helped them to grow, really. But secondly, it created across the whole swathe of these local stations a wonderful training ground for people who wanted to be radio journalists. There was quite a significant career flow, if you like, from local communities through the pirate stations for many years thereafter.
How would you describe the social impact of these radio stations in rural Ireland, particularly in the northwest, broadcasting in the 1980s when there hadn't been radio stations there before?
In order to attract audiences and for the audiences to attract advertising, it had to be sort of, broadly speaking, middle-of-the-road stuff. But you didn't get the feeling that there was some unhidden Ed Murrows out there waiting to be discovered. They were plain-spoken, useful, but above all, the usefulness, I think, to local communities of these radio stations was very high, and they succeeded to the degree that they managed to find a model for that usefulness in what they produced.
Media historian John Horgan. He referred to a famous American journalist, Ed Murrow, who was renowned for broadcasting from London during the Second World War, telling radio listeners in the then neutral United States what it was like for the city to suffer the German bombing campaign known as the Blitz.
Earlier this evening, we could hear occasionally, again, those were explosions overhead. We heard a number of bombs go sliding and slithering across to fall several blocks away. Just overhead now, the burst of the anti-aircraft fire.
An example of the power of radio. American correspondent Ed Murrow reporting from London in 1940, giving listeners in the US a picture of a city at war. His report is cited as one of the reasons Americans supported helping Europe defeat Nazi Germany.
Don't answer me, I never want to know. Don't answer me, I never want to know.
The Pattersons, a folk trio from Donegal who had hit records in the 1960s and 1970s. One of the group, Billy Patterson, saw the influence of pirate radio stations over the Irish music industry in the 1980s.
They opened the public's eyes and they startled the government, so I think they were doing a very good job. Sometimes you have to be ahead of the posse. If you were to sit around and wait on the government to do things, you could have a long wait. I think the pirates did a splendid job, if I may say so, in giving music to the public, all kinds of music, particularly local musicians, people who are trying to get a foot in the door. I think it was a very good step to have the pirates.
Would it be your view that the pirate radio stations laid the foundation for local radio as it is today in Ireland?
Of course it did, because they were working for several years, I think. So we obviously had to take lessons from what the pirates were doing and modify it. But the pirates came and the pirates went, but the pirates left a good legacy behind them that we had to stand up to the bar and face up to that and give the people what they wanted to hear, because that's what they were used to.
Billy Patterson, one of the founders of Highland Radio, Donegal's first officially licensed station, which took to the airwaves in 1990. Pirate radio stations broke long-standing music industry rules on not accepting payment to play records. I can reveal owners of unlicensed stations often receive money, effectively a bribe, from musicians or their managers to play certain records. It was a shady part of the business, but it wasn't new. The practice, known as payola, was a scandal in the United States in the 1950s, and it was also rife in Europe in the 1960s, as Ray Anderson, pirate historian, and the owner of Laser, which broadcast from a ship in the North Sea in the mid-80s, explains.
They relied a lot on record companies to give some money to play the records. And payola is a very, very taboo word in the United States of America, but probably less so in Europe, because it definitely went on. I mean, if you think about Radio Luxembourg in the 60s, playing just Decca records, well, it is what it was. They were buying the airtime to play their records. Laser did actually have these things called spotlight songs, which a record company could buy. And then they'd say at the end of it, a spotlight song is a Laser paid commercial. So they got round it by playing it as a commercial. But Caroline was doing the same. They were taking money to play a record so many times a week. But to be honest with you, the advertising revenues were tiny compared with what they'd been in the 60s. I mean, in the 1960s, there'd been talks of stations making millions of pounds, like Radio London apparently made millions, several millions of pounds in just less than 3 years. With Radio London, they were able to get Heinz and Lever Brothers and Coca-Cola and everybody that was anybody.
A light breeze and unusually a mild day here in the Blue Stack Mountains in South Donegal. I've travelled to the site where I operated an FM transmitter broadcasting across the coast, reaching towns like Killybegs, Ballyshannon, Bundoran and south to Sligo. My radio station, KTOK, fed the regional audience with a diet of top 40 pop music, whereas the local competition, Glencoe Radio in Mount Charles, played country music. I chose the site here because it's high with a view across the Atlantic coast. FM radio, which was fairly new to Ireland in the 1980s, works on line of sight. A retired farmer allowed me to put the transmitter in an old house he'd built in the 1930s, and the signal in stereo was tuned into by tens of thousands of listeners. The signal from the studio in Donegal Town was received here in the Blue Stack Mountains and relayed by a more powerful transmitter to the region. A local engineer, Jerry Duffy, maintained the technology behind KTOK. Jerry and other pirate engineers across the country were learning skills that would prove useful for building telecom networks for the booming mobile phone industry in the 1990s. Jerry Duffy has fond memories of pirate radio in Donegal.
Let's face it, there was only TV masts, were the only masts you've seen around the country, and then with the advent of the mobile phone, the radio transmitters were kind of the first of the small-scale transmitters, if you like, that you could hike up maybe 50, 60 feet with some sort of a makeshift poles and guy wires and stuff.
What about health and safety? We hear tales of people climbing these very rickety masts for the pirate radio stations up on a mountain top in a gale, in a storm.
Yeah, they'd frown on most of that stuff now by today's regulations. When I was that age, which would have been, maybe in my late teens, early 20s, you didn't look at safety as being a paramount thing.
Looking back now, we know that people like yourself who were working in the technical and engineering side of these radio stations were actually creating a group of people with the skill set which would prove very useful for Ireland when the technology boom happened, when the mobile phone industry took off. So I suppose those pirate radio stations, the unlicensed ones, were responsible for giving a training ground to a whole group of people who certainly helped the Irish economy.
Yeah, in a nutshell, that would be the case, because it was a completely new type of industry. And like for me, I've gone on to do quite a lot of transmission stuff, albeit microwave and stuff, but the principle of climbing up on a mast and mounting a piece of equipment is still the same. Although I suppose there wouldn't have been a huge amount of people involved in the early radio stations, maybe one or two in each county that would know anything about it. But once the phones came along, it was a mass rollout thing and proper, infrastructure, proper towers, concrete bases, proper cabins and proper electric supplies, not running a cable through a field for 2 miles to somebody's barn. Well, you did what you had to do to make stuff work, and often you were working under conditions that were less than favourable, let's say, and under the cover of darkness sometimes. You made the effort to try and just make it work.
What about the possibility that you were breaking the law?
Nah, never crossed my mind. I thought, well, they're illegal until they're made legal, so as far as I could see, it wasn't harming anyone.
Happens all the time, it's gonna happen. Oh my perfect cousin, what I like to do, he doesn't. I wanna hold her tight. That teenage kicks right through the night.
By the 1980s, the Undertones from Derry had recorded several international hit records, but in 1983 the band split. Their bass guitarist Michael Bradley was wondering if he could get into pirate radio. He became a disc jockey on a station close to Derry across the border in Donegal.
You know, when you look back at the technology that was available at the time, radio wasn't new, but it wasn't something that people could easily have access to, ordinary people have access to. So when all these different people started up radio stations, the word would be democratizing it. You know, you can draw parallels with social media now. Pirate radio, they were like the equivalent of Facebook today. People tuned in, people knew who was broadcasting, and you would kind of sometimes think, it's not very good, but you're kind of missing the point. You know, they were there and they were telling people what was happening in their areas. Derry was well served with foil, I think, radio foil. But, you know, Buncrana, other parts of Northern Ireland as well. Definitely, it was something to look back on, and I think appreciate.
You would have heard radio stations not only abroad, but also were able to make a comparison between Dublin and the stations in the rest of the country. Did you see a marked difference?
Even like in the late 70s almost, I was aware that there were pirate stations in Dublin, more along the lines of the pirate stations in the 60s, offshore Britain, before RT2 and before all the commercial stations emerged. The role of playing alternatives to the pop charts, the role of broadcasting that would have been the pirates in Dublin. But just reading about them too in hot press and so on, you know, there was definitely a scene happening there.
Many people would have their own favourite Undertones record, but what about you? Is it possible to pin down one particular song or track that you have as a favourite?
Well, yes. It always comes back to a song called You've Got My Number, Why Don't You Use It? Its single came out in, I think it was October 1979. John O'Neill would have written most of the songs and we would have added ones. So I remember in the summer of 79 we were practicing and John came along and says, I've got a new song. And he played it and I thought, this is great.
You got my number. Why don't you use it?
Do you have a particular favourite memory of pirate radio?
My particular memory of pirate radio would be whenever I was doing those shows. But I didn't even see it as an opportunity. It was just a great experience, playing records. For me, it was definitely about being behind a microphone, you know.
Michael or Mickey Bradley, a guitarist with Derry's big hit makers, the Undertones, recalling his adventures in pirate radio. Joe Gallagher runs an entertainment agency in Strabane, but in the 1980s he was a disc jockey on KTOK radio in Donegal, as well as working in nightclubs in Scandinavia. He says the Pirates were good on-air training grounds for programme presenters, and the experience of being on air was memorable.
You know, you got a chance in a non-licensed station where you needed to be something special to get in the door to the BBC or to get into the door to Downtown Radio or RT or whatever. You serve your apprenticeship on license and stations like KTOK, and you're 100% right about the professionalism. And even yet, I believe if something like KTOK came into the Donegal area, it would put the rest of them to shame.
You're a native of Strabane in County Tyrone in the northwest. You'd have seen the impact of pirate radio stations in the region and the impact that the alternative radio sector, the unlicensed ones, had on the communities.
Strabane's an outpost of Donegal. So if you had a radio station in Donegal, you had a lot of Strabane listeners, a lot of maybe Derry listeners on the border area. It was their station as much as a Donegal-based station, and they became part of it.
Joe Gallagher. Professor Owen Devereux from the University of Limerick is a commentator on social affairs who worked on a local pirate station in the city in the 80s. He believes the unlicensed broadcasters in Ireland benefited from people who had experience working on stations abroad, notably the UK.
The radio station that I worked with was a radio station called Big L Radio, Big Limerick, Big L Radio. And the owner of that radio station came from London, and he had had a vast experience as a broadcaster before that. He was also, I think, an electronic engineer, so he was able to build a very high-end studio, even borrowing jingles from Radio London, borrowing programming formats from the UK, all helped in the mix.
Wonderful Radio London, where you're hearing things, where you're hearing things.
Disc jockeys and presenters came to Ireland from other contexts, in the UK, for example, and elsewhere. I think all of that added into the mix in terms of improving the quality of radio.
When you look back at that era, come the mid-80s, when radio had got maybe more professional, do you look back with a smile on your face?
Well, I do. And I suppose what I think, but most of all about my experience of working on pirate radio was how much agency, how much freedom we had in terms of choosing our own playlists and the kinds of programming that we did. The station I worked on was one of the first to have an outside broadcast unit. And it did things like broadcast the novena, it broadcast mass, sport. It really recognized very early on that sport was a huge draw in terms of sponsorship and advertising and revenue. I still think we had that freedom, that agency to be creative. Nowadays, I'm afraid that's all gone. Local radio, I think, has lost its way in terms of the creativity that might have existed.
It's an overcast but mild day here in Burt, a small border community, basically a suburb of Derry City in County Donegal. I'm in the shadow of the hill that has the Green Inn of Aliach Iron Age fort at the top. It's one of Donegal's many ancient structures, which gives a good view of Lough Swilly and Lough Foyle. The neighbouring hill is where RTE placed a transmitter which gave Derry and Strabane, alongside other places in Northern Ireland, good reception of Irish radio and television. Pirate radio stations in Donegal during the 80s had the same intention, to broadcast into places like Derry to maximise their audience. But unlike RTE, the privately owned broadcasters were targeting the same businesses that placed advertisements in the region's newspapers, notably publications like the Derry Journal. I've travelled to Burt to meet Pat McCart, a former managing editor of the Derry Journal, to hear his memories of pirate radio stations broadcasting from Donegal to audiences across the border, and to get his analysis of the competition for advertising.
Most of the levers of power in the north were very much the newsletter, the Belfast Telegraph. Those were very much unionist dominated. The BBC was totally unionist dominated. So suddenly to have a local station where local names, local events, and people loved it because suddenly they were being represented and presented in a normal way.
Did you perhaps see the upsurge of so many radio stations broadcasting to the readers of the Derry Journal perhaps as a threat to the newspaper's advertising income?
No, that's one of the myths. Pirate radio was able to get advertising, there was no doubt about that. But you couldn't sell a house really on the radio. In fact, in a strange sort of way, I think pirate radio broadened the pot a wee bit.
It must have been disheartening when you published the Derry Journal on a Tuesday and a Friday to find within minutes of the newspaper being delivered, the local radio stations, unlicensed pirates, were basically lifting the news.
I remember on one occasion, and I very well, the lead story on page 1, the story on page 3 and the story on page 5 were the three main items on, I presume it was NWCR, I'm not 100% certain. And I was thinking, they weren't at any of the three venues for the stories, so they just lifted them. We were providing them with the news, but they were taking the credit for the news.
I'm Russ Padmore, recalling the days of pirate radio in Donegal and the Northwest in the 1980s. This has been a personal journey for me, and hopefully it's brought back some memories for you. If you weren't around in the 80s, you've learned how pioneers of pirate radio paved the way for the network of local radio stations in Ireland today. We were making history and disrupting the media industry by challenging the dominance of RTE and regional newspapers. But radio was also fun. Here's some memories from disc jockeys on air in the 80s, Laura Hughes at KTOK, Canis Wilson from Northwest Community Radio, and first Tommy Rosney from DCR.
Well, I remember, as well as doing the Radio Donegal in Letterkenny, myself and a few of my friends, during my summer holidays, we would go down and we would do what we call pirate radio stations in Dunlow and Burtonport. We'd have a caravan down in Burtonport, and for the first week we would call ourselves Radio Burtonport, and we'd only have a signal about 5 miles. And then on the Sunday evening we would come up to Dunlow and we'd be in the caravan, and we used to be living in the caravans. I remember one time I was doing a show down in Dunlow, and it was a real stormy day, and you were playing the records, and the caravan that we were in was being held up by blocks, and there was a storm and the caravan was shaking, and I was playing the records, but you know the springs on the record players, the record player was just playing as normal.
It was the first time I'd ever gone out on air, I'd forgotten that when you're queuing and you go on air, it turns down the music in the background. And all I could hear was this dead air. And I remember just going, oh no, what have I pressed? What's happened? And that went out on the airways. People found it hilarious out there. And I got so many requests and dedications after that. When you make a mistake like that, people take you under their wing. And that was the thing. And then as my experience grew, my fan base grew with that. But it was mortifying. Like, it was crazy mortifying. And it certainly tested my mettle that I was able to carry on and pretend it didn't happen, because the show must go on, as it were, you know. That was live radio, and that was pirate radio, and it was brilliant.
Back in 1985, November of 1985, I knew the two owners of that particular radio station, NWCR in Buncrana. They were doing interviews for positions. On that particular night, I arrived and I find that there was a queue from the radio station, which was situated above a jeweller's shop, right down Main Street in Buncrana. So I arrived with my bag of records and I did my hour. The next suggestion was maybe you would do a show for us. I think it was between 3 and 5. Eventually I ended up on NWCR between 2 and 4. That's where it all started for me.
Following my days as a pirate on the airwaves across the northwest, I worked as a disc jockey on commercial radio stations in the UK, and then I had a very long career with the BBC as a television news reporter, but mostly as a presenter and reporter with World Service Radio. Sometimes when I was in the studio, waiting to go on air to a global audience of more than 300 million, surrounded by modern digital equipment, I would recall those days in a very basic studio in Buncrana or Donegal Town. A fond memory of how working in pirate radio was a good experience, preparing me for broadcasting on the world's biggest station. I still remember that day in December 1988 when I was forced to close KTOK radio.
Thanks for your support. This is not the end, just the beginning. Mine is the first voice and the last voice you'll hear at KTOK radio. It's 4 o'clock and KTOK radio is now closing down.
The government had passed a law to introduce a system of licensing. Only one licence for North Donegal, even though the county had at least 6 pirate stations. I put together a consortium to apply for one of the licences, and in 1989 we attended a public hearing in Sligo as part of the government's process of deciding which group to hand a licence to. The national process was hindered by political cronyism, mismanagement and unproven claims of corruption, which meant many popular pirates like KTOK or NWCR never returned. Bidding for a broadcast licence cost a lot of money, especially a fee paid to the government, and yet I had to find out from RTE's television news that I had been unsuccessful. It was an example of mismanagement and the government's unprofessional approach. Musicians owe their success to unlicensed broadcasters. The media business was disrupted and radio was changed for good. More diversity gave opportunities for more women to get into broadcasting, and radio was transformed into a professional business, creating jobs for presenters, producers, journalists and advertising sales staff. And in the decade before the Good Friday Agreement, pirates with cross-border audiences had a social impact which united communities. Unlicensed stations left a lasting legacy for broadcasting in Ireland. So when you tune into your local station, remember it owes a lot to the pirates who ruled the airwaves in the 1980s. I'm Russ Padmore. Thanks for your company on this journey through the history of pirate radio. This programme was funded by Commission Amman with the television licence fee.